What happens when a daughter buries her mother, only to discover days later that the woman she mourned had been living a second life for years, a secret penthouse? Unexplained business trips, a door that opens to reveal a truth no child is ever prepared to face. The real heartbreak isn't just losing a parent, it's realizing the person trusted most may never have been fully known. They say the truth always comes out, but when it comes too late, is it strong enough to heal, or does it simply shatter what's left? When a hidden life surfaces after death, should loyalty protect the memory, or should honesty finally take its place? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now I'd like to invite you to listen to her confession. The call came at 5:42 a.m., sharp and unnatural against the quiet of my Charleston home. A South Carolina state trooper spoke in a calm, practiced tone that immediately told me something irreversible had happened. My mother, Celestine Montgomery, had been killed in a collision with a commercial truck on I-26 while driving toward Atlanta for what she had always described as another routine business trip. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. What settled over me instead was a heavy numbness, like my body had decided to shut down every emotional response at once. My mother had spent the last decade disappearing for days at a time, always with a suitcase, always with the same brief explanation work. I had grown used to her absence. This time, though, she wasn't coming back. Her funeral in Charleston was elegant, orderly, and strangely impersonal. The chapel filled with business associates, art gallery owners, and investors whose names meant nothing to me. They spoke of her professionalism, her sharp mind, her discretion. Yet not a single person shared a personal memory. No childhood friends, no close confidants. As I stood beside her casket, I realized that the woman everyone praised was someone I barely recognized. In the days that followed, one question echoed relentlessly in my mind. What was my mother really doing during all those business trips over the past 10 years? 3 days after the funeral, Trent Hollister, my mother's longtime attorney, arrived at my home. He carried a slim leather folder and wore the solemn expression of a man delivering more than routine paperwork. After offering brief condolences, he handed me an envelope containing a sleek electronic key card and a set of legal documents. The property listed was a penthouse apartment in Midtown Atlanta, Orium Heights, 34th floor. The ownership had been transferred to me effective immediately upon my mother's death. She left specific instructions, Trent said gently. This property is now yours. I stared at the document, stunned. My mother had never mentioned owning any real estate in Atlanta. In fact, she had always shut down any conversation about her work or travel. Whenever I pressed for details, she would grow cold and defensive, accusing me of not trusting her. Over time, I stopped asking. Inside the envelope was a small, folded note in her handwriting. Just one line, Zafira, I owe you the truth. My hands trembled as I realized the property had been purchased 9 years ago. For nearly a decade, my mother had owned a luxury penthouse in another city, and I had known nothing about it. At first, I decided I would sell it immediately. It felt like an unnecessary complication, an asset tied to secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But the sense of betrayal grew stronger with each passing hour. I couldn't let strangers or even paperwork define what this place meant. I needed to see it for myself. 2 days later, I stood on the sidewalk in Midtown Atlanta, craning my neck to look up at the gleaming glass tower of Orium Heights. The 34th floor seemed impossibly distant, suspended between sky and steel. As I held the key card in my hand, one thought settled heavily in my chest. I had no idea who my mother really was. The elevator ride to the 34th floor was silent and smooth, each passing number heightening my unease. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a quiet, softly lit corridor that smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. My footsteps echoed as I approached the penthouse door. I hesitated for only a second before pressing the key card to the panel. The lock clicked open. The moment I stepped inside, I knew this place did not belong to the woman who had raised me in a traditional, historic Charleston home, filled with antique furniture and muted colors. The penthouse was sleek modern and curated with bold confidence. Abstract paintings dominated the walls. Sculptural light fixtures cast warm, artistic shadows. A glass wine display showcased expensive French vintages. The air carried a faint blend of jasmine and cedar. This wasn't just a second property, it was an entirely different life. As I moved deeper into the living space, I noticed details that unsettled me even more. On a chair rested a light cardigan that clearly didn't belong to my mother's style. On a side table sat a half-finished cup of tea, still faintly warm. This place wasn't abandoned. Someone was here. Then I heard its soft jazz drifting from the living room, followed by the quiet sound of footsteps. I froze. A woman stepped into view, appearing to be around 30. She had steady eyes, composed posture, and an expression that was more resigned than surprised. She looked directly at me and said calmly, "You weren't supposed to come this soon." My heart pounded. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Rowan Avery Blake," she replied, "and I live here." The words hit like a physical blow. I tightened my grip on my bag. "This apartment belongs to my mother, Celestine Montgomery." Rowan's gaze softened, but she didn't look confused. "I know," she said quietly. "She's my mother, too." The room seemed to tilt. I struggled to process what I had just heard. Rowan explained that she had been living in the penthouse for the past 4 years. It wasn't a temporary arrangement or a favor. This was her home, purchased and maintained by Celestine Montgomery. When I demanded clarity, Rowan didn't hesitate. She told me she was born in 1994, 1 year before my mother married my father. The timeline fell into place with brutal clarity. My mother had been pregnant before her marriage, and under pressure from the influential Montgomery family, the child had been placed for adoption shortly after birth. But Rowan had not been abandoned. In her early 20s, Rowan had been contacted by my mother. What began as cautious communication evolved into a quiet, sustained relationship. My mother had supported her financially, emotionally, and eventually bought this penthouse so they could spend time together without disrupting the carefully constructed image of her life in Charleston. As Rowan spoke, memories resurfaced my mother's frequent trips, her guarded phone calls, the way she would return home, both lighter and more distant. Every unexplained absence now had a face, a place, and a story. I walked slowly through the living room, seeing everything differently now. The modern art, the youthful wardrobe in the closet, the warmth in the space. This wasn't a secret hideaway. It was a sanctuary built for a daughter I never knew existed. Rowan watched me carefully, giving me space, but not retreating. There was no hostility in her demeanor, only a quiet readiness for confrontation that she must have anticipated for years. Standing in that penthouse, surrounded by the physical proof of my mother's hidden life, one question echoed relentlessly in my mind. If my mother had another daughter, another family, what else had she kept from me all these years? Rowan didn't say much after revealing the truth about our shared mother. Instead, she walked quietly to a low cabinet near the window and returned with a rectangular wooden box. The surface was worn smooth with age, its brass latch slightly tarnished. She set it gently on the coffee table between us. "These are for you," she said, "or maybe for both of us." Inside were dozens of handwritten letters carefully bundled and labeled by year. My mother's handwriting, elegant, precise, unmistakable, covered every envelope. My fingers trembled as I picked up the earliest one addressed to Rowan. The date marked a time when Rowan would have been in her early 20s. As I read, a different version of my mother began to take shape. She apologized repeatedly for the years of silence, for the fear that had dictated her choices, for not having the courage to live honestly. Her words were filled with longing and regret. She wrote about watching Rowan grow from a distance, about the ache of missing birthdays, milestones, and ordinary days that mothers are meant to share with their children. Letter after letter revealed a deep emotional bond that had grown stronger over time. My mother didn't just support Rowan financially, she was trying in her own imperfect way to reclaim a relationship she had once been forced to abandon. Then I noticed a recurring name, Helena Voss. In several letters, my mother spoke of Helena with a tenderness and familiarity that went far beyond friendship. As I continued reading, the full truth unfolded. They had met in college. Helena had been my mother's first love, intense, formative, and deeply meaningful. But in the conservative Southern environment in which my mother was raised, that relationship was deemed unacceptable. Under immense family pressure, she ended the relationship, concealed her identity, and married my father to preserve the family's reputation. The Penthouse in Atlanta, I realized, was not just a place where my mother could spend time with Rowan. It had also been a private refuge where she and Helena reunited over the years. It was a space where my mother allowed herself, even if only temporarily, to live authentically free from expectations, judgment, and the rigid image she maintained in Charleston. Near the bottom of the box, I found more recent letters. In one addressed to Rowan, written less than a year before her death, my mother shared a bold and emotional plan. She intended to come clean about everything when I turned 40. She wanted to separate from the life she had built on obligation, restructure her assets, and formally introduce Rowan into the family as my sister. She wrote about her hope that, given time and honesty, I might understand and even accept the truth. But another letter, this one addressed to Helena, told a more complicated story. The tone was conflicted, cautious. My mother expressed concern that their relationship had begun to revolve more around financial security than emotional connection. She questioned whether the love they once shared had been overshadowed by expectations and dependence. I set the letter down slowly, the weight of it settling deep in my chest. My mother hadn't just been living two separate lives. She had been trying in the final chapter of her life to step out of one and reconcile the other. The tragedy was that she never got the chance to finish what she had started. Armed with the address I found among the letters, I decided to meet Helena Voss face to face. Her gallery was located in a refined section of Midtown Atlanta, surrounded by upscale boutiques and modern architecture. The space itself was striking high ceilings, polished concrete floors, and dramatic lighting that highlighted a collection of sleek, metal sculptures. The atmosphere reflected a life shaped by aesthetics, precision, and control. Helena greeted me with composed elegance. She appeared calm, almost as if she had anticipated this meeting. Her posture was confident, her expression measured, revealing little, but suggesting she was prepared for whatever I might say. "I'm Zafira Montgomery," I began, "Celestine's daughter." A flicker of recognition passed through her eyes, followed by a quiet nod. She confirmed without hesitation that she and my mother had shared a romantic relationship for more than 3 decades. Their connection, she explained, had endured through separations, obligations, and long periods of silence, but it had never truly ended. Helena told me that my mother had been planning to move in with her permanently once she had resolved her family and financial responsibilities. According to Helena, the Penthouse was not just a meeting place, it was a shared sanctuary, a reflection of a life they had built together in secret. The conversation soon shifted to finances. Helena stated that my mother had promised to leave her a significant portion of her estate, including proceeds from a life insurance policy and access to a private investment fund. She referred to the Penthouse as our space, emphasizing that it symbolized their commitment and shared future. I reminded her firmly that I was the legal heir to my mother's estate. Helena responded with a calm but cutting remark that I had never truly known my mother, and that Celestine's secrecy had been driven by fear of judgment, particularly from me. Then Helena presented a document, a copy of a draft prepared 6 months before the accident. The document outlined a division of assets among 3 people, Rowan, Helena, and me. However, the signature line was incomplete, and there was no official notarization. It was a plan, not a finalized decision. Helena suggested that my mother's hesitation to formalize the document stemmed from concern about how I would react. Her words were carefully chosen, implying that my presence in my mother's life had been a barrier to her full authenticity. After leaving the gallery, I returned to the penthouse and confronted Rowan with what I had learned. Rowan admitted that in the final months of our mother's life, tension had grown between Celestine and Helena, particularly over financial matters. Rowan had overheard several arguments during which Helena pushed for changes to insurance beneficiaries and increased financial commitments. This revelation shifted my perspective. What I had initially perceived as a tragic love story, complicated by social pressure, now carried undertones of financial strain and conflicting priorities. Standing in the penthouse that had once symbolized freedom for my mother, I began to question Helena's intentions more deeply. As the day came to a close, one realization became impossible to ignore. The story of my mother's hidden life was not just about love, sacrifice, and identity. It was also entangled with expectations, money, and motives that were far more complex than I had ever imagined. In the days following my meeting with Helena, the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like the center of a complicated web I was only beginning to understand. Determined to separate emotion from fact, I contacted Trent Hollister and asked him to conduct a thorough review of my mother's financial records. If Celestine Montgomery had lived a hidden life, the truth would be reflected not only in her letters, but also in her financial decisions. We met at Trent's office in downtown Atlanta, where stacks of documents were already organized across a long mahogany table. Together, we examined every detail of my mother's insurance policies, investment portfolios, and banking history. The process was meticulous, but one discovery quickly stood out. 5 months before her death, my mother had submitted a formal request to change the beneficiary of her life insurance policy from me to Helena Voss. The revelation struck me with unexpected force. Despite everything I had learned, seeing Helena's name in official documentation felt like a confirmation that my mother had once intended to secure Helena's future. However, as Trent continued reviewing the file, he pointed to a subsequent document. 3 weeks before the accident, my mother had formally revoked that change, restoring me as the sole beneficiary. The reversal raised immediate questions. Something significant must have occurred during those final weeks to prompt such a decisive action. Further examination uncovered another critical detail, a secondary investment account jointly held by my mother and Helena. The account contained a substantial sum of money and had been used intermittently over the years. While the existence of this account suggested a level of trust and shared planning, it also indicated a financial entanglement that extended beyond a purely emotional relationship. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, I searched for additional clues. Rowan allowed me access to my mother's personal laptop, which had remained untouched since her death. After several attempts, I managed to log in and began reviewing her emails and documents. Among them, I discovered a draft message addressed to Trent Hollister that had never been sent. The message was brief but deeply revealing. I made a mistake trusting Helena with financial matters. The words lingered on the screen as I read them repeatedly. The tone suggested regret and a growing awareness that Helena's involvement in her finances may not have been entirely benign. It became clear that my mother had been in the process of restructuring her estate and distancing Helena from her assets before her death. The following day, I received a text message from Helena requesting a private meeting. Reluctant but aware that avoiding her would only prolong the tension, I agreed. We met at a small cafe across the street from her gallery, a quiet place where the hum of conversation provided a thin layer of anonymity. Helena arrived precisely on time, her demeanor composed, yet noticeably strained. Without preamble, she accused me of isolating Rowan and attempting to erase the final chapter of my mother's life. She insisted that I was claiming a love I had never understood and suggested that my actions were driven by resentment rather than truth. During the conversation, Helena mentioned that on the day of the accident, my mother had changed her travel route in order to meet Trent earlier than scheduled. The comment caught my attention immediately. Until that moment, I had accepted the accident as a tragic but random event. After returning to the penthouse, I requested a copy of the official accident report. The document confirmed that my mother had altered her route approximately 15 minutes before the collision. Additionally, data retrieved from her phone revealed an unsent text message drafted shortly before the crash. "I need to fix everything before it's too late." The message suggested urgency and a determination to resolve unresolved matters, likely related to her estate and her relationship with Helena. While there was no direct evidence of foul play, the timing of these events introduced an unsettling ambiguity. For the first time, I found myself questioning whether the accident had been entirely coincidental. Recognizing that the lingering tension among us could not remain unresolved, I decided to organize a meeting at the Penthouse. My intention was to bring clarity to the situation and establish a definitive understanding of each person's role in my mother's legacy. Rowan agreed to be present, and Helena accepted the invitation after a brief hesitation. On the afternoon of the meeting, the atmosphere inside the Penthouse was charged with quiet anticipation. The three of us gathered in the living room, the same space where I had first encountered Rowan, and learned the truth about our shared mother. This time, however, the purpose was not discovery, but resolution. I began by presenting the evidence Trent had compiled. I explained the sequence of events regarding the life insurance policy, emphasizing that while my mother had once designated Helena as the beneficiary, she had officially reinstated me 3 weeks before her death. I also shared the contents of the unsent email in which my mother expressed regret over entrusting Helena with financial matters. Helena listened in silence, her expression shifting from confidence to resignation. When she finally spoke, she did not deny that she had encouraged my mother to secure her financial future. Instead, she defended her actions by emphasizing the sacrifices she believed she had made. She described decades of loving Celestine in secrecy, enduring social judgment, and living in the shadows of a relationship that could never be publicly acknowledged. From her perspective, financial security represented recognition of that lifelong devotion. The conversation then turned to Rowan. Helena attempted to persuade her to stand in solidarity, appealing to their shared connection with my mother and the emotional history they both carried. She spoke of loyalty, of honoring Celestine's true self, and of preserving the life they had envisioned together. Rowan, however, responded with quiet conviction. She acknowledged the love that had existed between Helena and our mother, but affirmed that in her final months, Celestine had sought reconciliation with me. Rowan revealed that our mother had expressed a desire to distance herself from Helena and to rebuild her relationship with both of her daughters openly and honestly. To conclude the discussion, I presented the final legal documentation provided by Trent. The last valid will confirmed that I was the sole heir to my mother's estate. Included within the document was a personal note from Celestine expressing her wish that Rowan continue to reside in the Penthouse, ensuring her stability and acknowledging their bond. As Helena absorbed this information, the reality of her legal position became undeniable. She possessed no enforceable claim to my mother's assets. The confidence that had characterized her earlier demeanor gave way to a quiet, bitter acceptance. Without further argument, she stood, offered a restrained farewell, and left the Penthouse. After the door closed behind her, a profound stillness settled over the room. The legal conflict that had loomed over us for weeks was effectively resolved. Rowan and I remained seated, processing the emotional weight of everything that had transpired. Yet despite the clarity we had achieved, one question lingered in my mind. The sequence of events leading up to my mother's death, the route changed the unsent message, and her apparent urgency to amend her affairs left an enduring sense of uncertainty. While there was no concrete evidence to suggest intentional wrongdoing, the ambiguity could not be entirely dismissed. Ultimately, I chose not to pursue a formal criminal investigation. My decision was guided by a desire to preserve what remained of my mother's memory and to focus on healing rather than suspicion. Still, the unanswered questions formed a subtle fracture in my understanding of her final days, a reminder that some truths, like the lives people lead, are never completely revealed. As I stood in the living room of the Penthouse looking out over the Atlanta skyline, I understood that the legal battle had ended, but the emotional journey was far from over. The legacy my mother left behind was not defined solely by assets or secrets, but by the opportunity to redefine what family meant. And with Rowan beside me, I knew that this new chapter, though born from loss and revelation, offered the possibility of reconciliation and peace. After Helena left the penthouse, an unfamiliar silence settled over the living room. The tension that had filled the space for weeks seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a stillness that felt both heavy and strangely peaceful. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the Atlanta skyline shimmer in the late afternoon light. For the first time since my mother's death, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I was feeling. The anger that had once burned so fiercely inside me had faded. In its place was a quiet emptiness shaped by the realization that my mother had spent decades living in fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and fear of losing the people she loved. Rowan sat across from me on the sofa, her presence no longer that of a stranger, but of someone who shared the same complicated grief. We began to talk about our mother not as a figure defined by secrets or deception, but as a woman flawed, conflicted, and deeply human. Rowan spoke about Celestine's warmth during their private moments together, the way she laughed freely in Atlanta, in contrast to the restrained demeanor she maintained in Charleston. I shared memories of a mother who had been disciplined, protective, and quietly loving, yet always emotionally distant. As we spoke, the fragmented pieces of her life began to form a more complete picture. After a long pause, Rowan rose and walked toward the cabinet where the wooden box of letters had been kept. She retrieved a small envelope that had been hidden beneath the others and handed it to me. "I think she wanted you to have this," Rowan said softly. My name was written on the front in my mother's familiar handwriting. The letter was dated 8 days before the accident. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper and began to read. In the letter, my mother confessed that Helena had been her first love, a relationship born in youth and intensified by the pain of being forced apart. She admitted that over the years, her connection with Helena had gradually transformed from love into a sense of obligation and guilt. She felt responsible for the sacrifices Helena had made and struggled with the belief that she owed her a future in return. Yet the most poignant part of the letter was her acknowledgement that the person she had never truly been honest with was me. She expressed deep regret for the emotional distance she had maintained throughout my life and wrote of her desire to rebuild our relationship with transparency and trust. One sentence in particular resonated deeply within me. "I was brave too late, but I chose you before I died." She explained that she had already taken steps to restore all of her assets to my name and had scheduled a meeting with Trent to ensure that her final wishes were legally secured. The letter was not only an apology, but also a declaration of her intention to reconcile the fragmented pieces of her life. As I finished reading, tears streamed down my face, not from anger, but from a profound sense of understanding. My mother had not been perfect, but she had been trying in her final days to make amends. In the quiet that followed, I contemplated the future of the penthouse. Initially, I had seen it as a symbol of betrayal, a tangible reminder of the secrets that had defined my mother's hidden life. Now, however, it represented something different, an opportunity to redefine what family meant. I turned to Rowan and told her that I had decided not to sell the penthouse. Instead, I wanted it to become a place of honesty and new beginnings. I invited her to continue living there not as a beneficiary of secrecy, but as my sister with a clear and transparent understanding of our shared inheritance. Rowan listened carefully before responding. To my surprise, she declined the idea of being financially dependent on me. She explained that she no longer wanted to live under the shadow of hidden support. What she desired most was a genuine sisterly relationship built on equality and mutual respect. Rowan proposed that we divide the inheritance in a fair and thoughtful manner and invest a portion of the funds into opportunities that would shape our individual futures rather than preserve them as symbols of the past. Her words moved me deeply. In that moment, I realized that although I had lost my mother, I had also gained something unexpected, a chance to build a real family. Together, we decided to clear out my mother's bedroom. The process felt ceremonial, as if we were gently closing one chapter while opening another. We removed a large, abstract painting that had dominated the wall, a piece that now seemed to embody the secrecy that had once defined her life. Among the personal items we discovered, I chose to keep a single photograph, an image of my mother holding Rowan as a newborn, her expression filled with a tenderness I had rarely witnessed. As we finished, I stood quietly in the room, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. For the first time, my thoughts shifted away from questioning why my mother had made the choices she did. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. What would I choose to do with the truth she had left behind? 3 months later, my life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. I sold the historic Charleston home where I had spent most of my life, a decision that symbolized my willingness to step beyond the confines of the past. I relocated to Atlanta, choosing an apartment close to the Penthouse, but maintaining a separate space to preserve both Rowan's independence and my own. The Penthouse itself underwent a thoughtful renovation. Heavy drapes were replaced with sheer curtains that allowed natural light to flood the rooms. The interior was redesigned to feel open and welcoming, shedding the aura of secrecy that had once defined it. What had once been a hidden refuge became a space of transparency and connection. During this period of transition, I received a final letter from Helena. The envelope arrived without a return address, yet I recognized her handwriting immediately. In the letter, Helena acknowledged that her desire for financial security had over time overshadowed the love she once shared with my mother. She reflected on the societal pressures that had forced them to live in secrecy and admitted that fear and resentment had shaped many of her decisions. Rather than responding or pursuing further legal action, I chose to let the matter rest. Continuing the cycle of conflict would only perpetuate the very patterns of secrecy and bitterness that had defined my mother's life. By allowing Helena to step away without further confrontation, I felt I was honoring the spirit of closure my mother had sought. Rowan and I also took steps to formalize our relationship legally. Through the appropriate legal procedures, we established official recognition of our shared parentage. This decision was not motivated by financial considerations, but by a desire to eliminate the final remnants of secrecy. When the documentation was completed, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Family was no longer an abstract concept shaped by hidden truths. It had become a conscious and intentional choice. On the first anniversary of our mother's passing, Rowan and I visited the Montgomery Family Cemetery. Standing before Celestine's headstone, I reread the final lines of her letter. Speaking aloud, I expressed my forgiveness and my determination to live differently, to embrace honesty and openness rather than concealment and delay. Rowan reached for my hand and, with quiet certainty, called me her sister. The simplicity of that moment carried more meaning than any legal document ever could. In the months that followed, we established the Celestine Foundation, a joint initiative dedicated to supporting women in the American South who had been forced to live divided lives due to societal expectations and prejudice. The foundation became a living tribute to my mother's struggles and a means of transforming her legacy into something constructive and hopeful. A portion of the inheritance was also invested in Rowan's dream of opening her own design studio, allowing her to build a future defined by independence and creativity. Inspired by everything that had transpired, I began writing a book exploring the hidden stories of Southern women and the burdens of secrecy they often carried. Through this work, I sought not only to understand my mother's life, but also to give voice to countless others who had faced similar challenges. One evening, as I stood by the penthouse window overlooking the vibrant city of Atlanta, I reflected on the journey that had reshaped my understanding of love, family, and identity. My mother had lived her life torn between duty and desire, unable to fully reconcile the two. I realized that her greatest legacy was not the wealth she left behind, but the lesson she imparted through her struggles. I did not simply inherit money or property. I inherited the truth, and with it, the freedom to choose a different path. Determined to honor that lesson, I embraced a future defined by honesty, compassion, and the courage to live authentically.